All right, you guys, last chapter. So the last chapter is chapter 12, and it is Cry of the Hunters. So at the end of chapter 11, we saw Sam and Eric being forced into Jack's tribe. We saw the boys kill Piggy. By the boys, I mean Jack's savages kill Piggy. And we also saw them throw a spear at Ralph, and Ralph has now taken off into the woods. He is in hiding from the boys. He knows that the boys are after him. They are after him to kill him. So Ralph is kind of in the woods, and he is able to hear some boys talking. And it turns out to be Sam and Eric, and he's able to talk to them enough. They give him food, but they won't come join him. They're frightened. And after Ralph leaves them, he is still in hiding, but he hears Jack and his boys torturing Sam and Eric to figure out where Ralph has gone. Ralph is hiding in this thicket. The boys attempt to roll rocks over the thicket to kill him, but the thicket is too thick and that does not work. So the next thing they do is they set the thicket on fire, which ends up setting over most of the island on fire, about half of the island on fire. And these boys are after him. I mean, it's like a savage manhunt. And there again, shrill and inevitable was the ululation sweeping across the island. At that sound, he shed like a horse among the creepers and ran once more till he was panting. He flung himself down on the ferns. The tree or the charge. He mastered his breathing for a moment, wiped his mouth, and told himself to be calm. Sam and Eric were somewhere in that line and hating it, or were they? And supposing instead of them he met the chief or Roger, who carried death in his hands. And so basically we haven't read The Most Dangerous Game yet, but when we read The Most Dangerous Game, these pages are so relatable because it's literally like being hunted for your life. And now the fire was nearer. Now the fire was near. Those volleying shots were great limbs, trunks even bursting. The fools. The fire must be almost at the fruit trees. And what would they eat tomorrow? And he sees a savage through the woods. The savage moved forward so that they could only see him from the waist down, so that you could only see him from the waist down. There's herds of pigs like running out of this fire. Ralph screamed, a scream of fright and anger and desperation. His legs straightened and the scream became continuous and foaming. He shot forward, burst. The thicket was in the open, screaming, snarling, bloody. He swung the stake and the savage tumbled over, and there were others coming at him, crying out. He swerved as a spear flew past, and then it was silent, running. And so that's the bottom of page 199. And he finds another place to hide, and then he looks up, and a naval officer stood in the sand. And Ralph is astonished. The officer looked at Ralph doubtfully for a moment and then held his hand away from the butt of his revolver. "Hello." Squirming a little, conscious of his filthy appearance, Ralph answered shyly, "Hello." The officer nodded as if in question had been answered. "Are there any adults, any grown-ups with you?" And so just to make clear, like, what brought the naval officer to this island is this massive fire that the boys set off, which is kind of ironic because they weren't trying to signal for a ship at that point in time. They were trying to kill Ralph. Dumbly, Ralph shook his head. He turned a half pace on the sand, a semicircle of little boys, their bodies streaked with colored clay, sharp objects in their hand, were standing on the beach, making no noise at all. Fun and games, said the officer. The officer thinks that they're being boys. They're playing a game. The fire reached the coconut palms by the beach and swallowed them noisily. The flame, seemingly detached, swung like an acrobat and licked up the palm heads on the platform. The sky was black. The officer grinned cheerfully at Ralph. We saw your smoke. What have you been doing? Having a war or something? And the officer's kind of joking about that. Ralph nodded. The officer inspected the little scarecrow in front of him. The kid needed a haircut, a bath, a nose wiped, and a good deal of ointment. No one killed, I hope. Any dead bodies? Only 2, and they're gone. The officer leaned down and looked closely at Ralph. 2? Killed? Ralph nodded. Behind him, the whole island was shuddering with flame. The officer knew, as a rule, when someone was telling the truth. He whistled softly. Other boys were appearing now, tiny tots, some of them, brown and distended bellies of small savages. One of them came close to the officer and looked up. I'm, but there was no more to come. Percival, Weemies, Madison, salt in his hand for an incantation that had faded clean away. Salt in his head for an incantation that had faded clean away. The officer turned back to Ralph. We'll take you off. How many of there are you? Ralph shook his head. The officer looked past at the group of painted boys. Who's boss here? I am, said Ralph loudly. A little boy who wore the remains of an extraordinary black cap on his head, on his red hair, who carried the remains of a pair of spectacles at his waist, started forward, and then changed his mind and stood still. We saw your smoke, and you don't know how many of there are. There are? No, sir. I should have thought, said the officer as he visualized the search before him. I should have thought that a pack of British boys, you're all British, aren't you, would have been able to put up a better show than that. I mean, it was like that at first, before things, said Ralph. He stopped. We were together then. The officer nodded helpfully. I know. Jolly good show, like the Coral Island. Ralph looked at him dumbly for a moment, and then with a fleeting picture of the strange glamour that had once invested the beaches. But the island was scorched up like dead wood. Simon was dead, and Jack had. The tears began to flow, and sobs shook him. He gave himself up to them now for the first time on the island. Great. Shuddering spasms of relief that seemed to reach his whole body. His voice rose under the black smoke before the burning wreckage of the island, and infected by the emotion, and the other boys began to shake and sob too. And in the middle of them, with filthy hair, matted hair, and unwiped nose, Ralph wept for the end of innocence, the darkness of man's heart, and the fall through the air of the true wise friend called Peggy. The officer, surrounded by their noises, was moved and a little embarrassed. He turned away to give them time to pull themselves together and waited, allowing his eyes to rest on the trim cruiser in the distance.